Okay, welcome back. We're here on Diaspata today. We're going to try something new for the first time and do our first live cast. We'll see if this works, of course, and if not, then the video will just get recorded and loaded up at a later time. But thanks for joining us today, and apologies for those. I know that there was some interest in the topic that we're going to start discussing today, which is what to do with the Jewish people. And the larger discussion that we'll be having through the month of August on that. We'll also be covering some other topics as well that I think will be really exciting as we get into the early fall in September. But thanks for joining us a little bit later than expected. We had some unexpected delays and hope to get those addressed soon. Today, though, what I wanted to do is just kind of cover a very short introduction here that I think is going to be pretty fundamental before we start talking about anything related to the Middle East, the Jewish people, and all of the stuff surrounding that, and that can include the political stuff, APAC and their influence in the United States, the theological debates that go on still to this day within the broader Reformed Christian world, which is the more conservative branch of Christianity, the more biblical branch of Christianity, as opposed to liberal branches, and just trying to kind of come up with a framework on how, even if we come to different conclusions on specific events and issues and people, we're applying, what the Bible would say is just weights and measures to this discussion. And this is something that has been heavy on my heart for a number of years. Not because I've got any kind of, royalty checks coming in here from anyone. We would obviously have a much larger operation at this point if that was the case. But instead, because I do feel that, and this has been a strong conviction of mine for decades now, that justice needs to be appropriate. It needs to be balanced. It needs to be righteous judgment and justice, not something that is tailored to tip the favor in the sway of one party over the other. And there are a number of different cases that we can talk about in our society about that. But in this decade so far, I think what has happened and why we're seeing the Overton window change so much and so rapidly in just a matter of 5+ years right now is because so much of what we believed and what we were told that we just accepted with related to feminism, global policy, just the benevolence of our governments towards us as citizens. All of that was shattered during COVID. I think a lot of eyes were opened. A lot of people were red pilled, as we say today, to just start questioning what they believed. And as a result, we're kind of on this feeding frenzy right now. So we're going to cover other topics that deal with this as well. I think we'll cover, like, for example, psychology, later on in the fall here on this podcast as well. But there's this feeding frenzy where we're not just questioning the stuff that we know are lies, but now we're moving into the territory of questioning things that have historic validity and that are provable. And if we're not careful, this is going to open the door for a dangerous situation where history itself could be rewritten, and wicked and evil people can use that to manipulate populations for generations to come. And with respect to the topic that we're going to cover here today, I won't go into this in great detail, but one of the things that has come up for discussion because of this is what is the role of the Holocaust, in World War II? And you have people now that are more open and willing to question whether the Holocaust happened today than were willing to do that even 5 years ago. It's not that there weren't people who were doing that even in the West. But it was very taboo to do so, and now all of that's changing because, unfortunately, when you tell one lie, to a person, if you're caught in that lie, and this is why the truth is so important, if you're caught in that lie, everything else that you've ever shared all of a sudden comes on the table and for scrutiny as well. Everything becomes questionable, and so this is why we want to cover this topic today, to try to kind of help again apply a right framework to how we deal with the Jewish people, and we'll talk about that in a minute as far as what that definition is, or definitions, as you'll see. But what I want to kind of stress here at the beginning is that we want to we want to seek for truth. We want to seek for righteousness. Again, I don't think that that should be something that any of us oppose. If this is something that is important to you as you're listening to this, or you think that there's a friend who maybe is struggling with this, feel free to share this as well. And my hope is that we can have a good discussion on this and many other topics as we head into the next few months here. And again, feel free to leave comments if there are questions or issues that you're either struggling with or that you want to challenge us on as we go through this. We're quite welcome to the quite happy to welcome those comments and feedback as well. So with that said, why don't we kind of jump in here? And what I'm going to do today, as I said, is I'm going to go through a very simple question, but a question that I think gets ignored to the peril of a lot of people who talk about, their relationship to the Jews and whether that's a favorable relationship or an unfavorable relationship. And without going into too much detail on this here today, because there's a lot that we could really cover, this topic goes back millennia. Again, I know that there are people that are going to question this, and this is going back to what I was just saying about history potentially being rewritten. But the Jewish people have existed in one way, shape, or form for thousands and thousands of years. They're a very ancient culture. There aren't many cultures that are, intact as clearly as the Jews are. After all this time of human history, even if you look at the Egyptians, for example, or the Persians, they went through different stages in history where, for example, with the Egyptians, they were very much Hellenized by the Greeks after the campaigns of Alexander the Great, and it really changed their culture from that point onward. The Persians, likewise, they still exist. I mean, it's called Iran today, but people in Iran will refer to themselves as Persian and take great pride in that culture. But the Persian culture was also very largely influenced by the invasion of the Muslims from Arabia back in the early Middle Ages as well. So what we know as Persia today, or what we know as Egypt, is not the same thing as what we knew in the ancient past, although there is obviously some connections there. And so the question, long term that we'll want to cover is that true for the Jews today? Right? Because some people will say, well, no, the Jews, they were so European if that's a word. They were so assimilated into European culture and Western culture that who they are today is nothing compared to the Jews that we read about in the Old and New Testaments, for example. So we'll cover that a little bit more as we move forward. But I do want to talk about just textbook definition. When we say, "Oh, that person's Jewish," what are we referring to when we say that? And so to bring this up on the screen here, I got all fancy here today and got my deck out to kind of walk us through this. I'm going to go through what I think are four main definitions of the Jews that we'll want to cover here today. And there are others that you could talk about. There's, for example, Black Hebrew. What is it? Black Hebrew Israelites or nationalism, Black Hebrew nationalists, which are groups from Africa that believe that they're part of the 10 lost tribes. We're not going to cover any of that kind of stuff today. We're just going to talk very mainline, definition orientation on what it means to be a Jew or what we're referring to when we say, that person's Jewish, right? That kind of thing. So the first four that I want to kind of cover here for us today is number one, religious Jews, right? And specifically that refers to anyone who's a practitioner of Judaism. And again, you can break this down further. You can talk about Orthodox Jews versus conservative Jews, and so on. There's a few different branches out there, but when we talk about someone, for example, being Jewish, right? That can mean, well, they adhere to some form of the Jewish religion, right? Where they've got a rabbi or they go to synagogue, or anything that's kind of wrapped up into a very religious definition. And this would be comparable to saying that someone's a Muslim, or someone's a Christian, or someone's a Hindu, or an atheist for that matter. This is just what we're referring to when we talk about Jews in the religious sense, is that they're practitioners of Judaism. Okay, so that's number one. Number two, ethnic Jews, right? And so this is where we're getting into, ethnic history, bloodlines and genealogies, right? Those are people who are descendant from the ancient Jewish people, or if we put it in biblical terms, we're talking about people who are descendants from Jacob the patriarch in Genesis. Right. And obviously, along the way, you can even look at Jesus's genealogy, which is recorded, for example, in Matthew chapter 1 at the beginning of the New Testament. There were Gentiles like Rahab the harlot, who was brought into that genealogy, but then she ended up being in the line that gave us King David and Solomon, and all the kings of Judah, right through until we get to Jesus. And so, yes, that does happen. But generally speaking, we're talking about people that are part of that ethnos, the people who are part of the Jewish line, right? That traces its heritage right back to Jacob, and ultimately Abraham. Although with Abraham, obviously we have Ishmael. We have Esau, right? Or there are people in those lines in within Abraham's line who are not Jewish because they became other branches in the family tree and were not part of the Jewish people in the biblical chronology of God creating His people Israel. Ethnically. So we could be talking about ethnic Jews, right? And this is usually something that we're talking about, for example, when we talk about again, World War II and what happened, during that time with the Holocaust. So, that's usually where this kind of definition of a Jewish person would come up in that context. So number three, national Jews, right? And so this is something that is, in our time, a relatively new or repurposed definition, because the Jews didn't have a state of their own. There's actually a funny little state in Russia that still bears the name. I forget what it's called, but it's Jewish something, out in the east part of Russia, in Asia. But generally speaking, the Jewish people for the better part of the last 2,000 years did not have their own place on the map that could say that is a Jewish state, right? That is a Jewish country. Today we do have obviously the state of Israel, and that is considered to be a Jewish state. And so in this case, and this is where it gets a little funny, even on a few different angles here, you can talk about citizens of the nation state of Israel, but anyone who is familiar with Israel will know that, in addition to the Jewish people who are either, again, going back to our first two definitions, either religious Jews or ethnic Jews, and came to Israel because they could either practice their religious faith as Jewish people, or they are ethnic Jews who are, feel some kind of connection to that land. There are also other people within the state of Israel who are actually Arabs. There are, ethnically Arabs, and there are people who are religiously Christians or Muslims who are also, legally speaking, and this is what we're really talking about here in this third definition, legal citizens of the state of Israel. That's what we're talking about here with the national Jews. But obviously, as we say that, there would automatically be a lot of caveats. People wouldn't consider, Arabs, for example, who have their residency and citizenship in Israel to be, national Jews, right? Usually, what we're talking about is a person who, in addition to having their passport from Israel, also falls into one of these two buckets, right? And so that's our third definition. The fourth one is the one that's kind of a little bit of an outlier, and this is, I think, where a lot of the controversy about how we talk about the Jewish people is going to come up here, and that is when people talk about the Jews, right? And I'll get into an example in a minute here on the next slide. They're really talking, at least on the surface, about specific individuals with an attachment to one or more of the above groups, right? And so, for example, if you look at the city of New York and its long and storied history in relationship with the Jewish people, there's a very large Jewish community in New York City. During COVID, which I mentioned earlier, you had a controversy where a Orthodox synagogue in New York City, I think they decided to open during COVID and raised the ear of the then governor Andrew Cuomo, who's actually now running for mayor of New York City as we speak. Where they basically went to court over this, and it became a constitutional issue. And so, this could be referring to, that specific group of Jews, so the group of Jews that were part of that synagogue involved in the COVID case. More politically, more controversially, when people are talking about the Jews, right, quote unquote, they could be referring to, specific individuals that they, for example, will point out and say that they are, causing issues, with the United States or causing issues with the West. And so this comes up, if you remember the movie a few years ago, Argo, which was about the true story of the evacuation of U.S. Citizens who worked in the embassy in Iran. They would talk about the Jewish relationship in Hollywood, for example, and the Jews, the Harvey Weinsteins, right, that are traditionally involved in the higher echelons of the movie industry in Hollywood. You can look at this in terms of the financial industry. You can look at individuals like George Soros. You can look at the Rothschilds. And so this is, another example of when people say, well, there's, a Jewish group who is influencing, our monetary system or our politics, like APAC. Sorry, I want to say IPAC. I don't know, maybe it's just the acronym, but it's APAC. I think American Israel Political Action Committee. They'll refer to them as, well, the Jews are influencing our politics, and what they're really referring to is APAC instead. And so, why I bring up these four definitions and why I think that this is, somewhere that we have to start as we have this conversation is, I think if we're not careful, and I've seen this actually play out with a lot of people that I have dear love and a lot of respect for. In recent conversations, I've said to people, for example, well, you don't, I've seen a lot of stuff online, people saying, well, I think the Jews are controlling the world, or they're running things and trying to, kind of basically destroy us, right? And I'll say, and I find it kind of ridiculous that people online will say this kind of stuff, that they think that the Jews are running the world. And then I've had a few examples now where people, again, people I really care about and respect will respond and say something to the effect of, well, aren't they? And then that's where these four definitions on the screen have to come into play. Because what do we mean by that if we're saying that? First of all, as I'll show later on in the next slide, I don't know if it's fair to say, the Jews, as in the religious Jews, are running the world, right, and causing all these kinds of schemes and conspiracies, right? Not conspiracy theories, mind you, but conspiracies. But are we saying that it's religious Jews who are doing this? Are we saying it's ethnic Jews that are doing this? Are we saying it's the Jewish state? I mean, that maybe part of that fifth definition I should have put in here is not just national Jews, but the government of Israel, right? In the same way that people talk about the Americans are sending ships to the Middle East, right? Which I think was done last week. We don't mean that all 330 million American citizens got together and said, we're going to send ships into the Middle East, right, to address whatever is going. I think it was related to Russia or something. What we usually mean by that is that the government, the representative government of the United States, under President Trump, has decided through its military branch to send ships into the Middle East. And as a result, we just call it the Americans, right? Or we'll say the Europeans have gotten together and come up with a trade deal to avoid higher tariffs, right? So we have to be careful about definitions because, again, it's one thing to maybe give a favorable thing, a favorable compliment to a group of people, and say like, the Americans are known for their, can-do spirit, which they are. It's another thing to say the Americans are being bullies or something like that, right? And so we have to be careful about those definitions. And whether we like it or not, before I go into the next slide here and give an example, I'll walk through on this. Whether we like it or not, the Jewish people historically, and again, I say this as a bit of a history buff, they have been through a lot of stuff, right? And it's debatable about, how much of this is, divine judgment, for rejecting Jesus as Messiah, in the New Testament. How much of this is just politics playing out in its natural course. But but if you look through history, I mean, this goes back beyond, the Holocaust, as I said. It goes beyond what's going on right now with the war between Israel and Hamas and in Gaza and all of that going on. It goes beyond, the Zionist movement in the 19th century. You can point to, for example, the Great Purge of the Jews that was done in Spain in the 15th century, which very few people would know about, or maybe a few people will be familiar with it. But like there's a lot of history. It's funny too because you got other, you've got had monarchs in Arabia of all places and Russia that weighed whether they were going to convert to Judaism, right? And that would have, one of them did in Arabia, and it really kind of changed the dynamic of history. But generally speaking, the Jewish people have for the better part of the last 2,000 years been seen as outsiders and outcasts in a variety of cultures that they've been living in. And so, I'll put it this way: is like, you know, if any of us have had our, own experiences where we kind of feel like a bit of an outsider, and that does happen. Maybe we're feeling like we're getting unfairly treated because we're not quite fitting in. I can understand how, you know, religious Jews and ethnic Jews and even national Jews can feel that way. I mean, like Israel, for example, the country, it's the only country in the Middle East that is not a Muslim majority Muslim system of some kind, right? And I get that there's different Muslim sects, between Shiite and Sunni, for example, but there's others as well there in the mix. Israel is kind of the outlier, and they weren't the ones, again, I know this is up for debate, but they weren't the ones that hand drew the map, that put them in there along with what is now Gaza, and Egypt and Jordan and the West Bank. This is a case where I can understand where there's a bit of sympathy or sensitivity, I should say, for Jewish people who feel a little kind of skittish about hearing talk, a lot of talk criticizing Jews out there because that's happened before, right? And I said recent history is probably more brutal than anything else, but it's happened in other centuries as well, right? And it's been something that if you grew up in that kind of culture and that kind of family, I can see how, you know, you're training your kids to say, well, you have to understand that by keeping this heritage, you're taking on a lot of a lot of risk, right, in your life as well. So, I said my job here today isn't to kind of get into all of those details. I just bring it up as an illustration, but I do want to, encourage us to basically speak fairly when we're talking about this and make sure that we're being clear about who we're referring to if we're going to have a criticism for, say, a George Soros out there. So I'm going to bring up the following phrase for us to consider, right? And this is again based on, some previous conversations and things I've seen online. And the phrase goes something like this. And this is, for the record, actually not what I believe at all. I think there's other people behind the problems in the world today, for the record. But let's consider it anyway. And the phrase is, it's likely that the Jews are behind the problems in the world today. Right. And so, again, based on what I just had on the last slide, the question now is, who are the Jews that we're referring to? Right. Remember, we had four, and actually, as I talked about it, technically 4.45 or five definitions of who the Jews could be referring to in this statement. And so, again, are we saying that every Jewish person that, has some kind of genetic makeup that traces its lineage back to Jacob, the patriarch in Genesis, is behind a vast conspiracy that is creating all the problems in the world today? And I know that if you put that to people, they would immediately say, "Whoa, whoa, whoa! That's not what I mean at all, right?" And that's good, right? I don't think that's fair. I think that would be bordering on some kind of racism at that point. In the same way, just to give you a comparison, the same way I hear Canadians these days talk about Americans, right? And they will get challenged and say, "Oh, I don't mean all Americans. I just mean the ones that voted for Trump," right? It's still, if you hear how a lot of Canadians talk, and there's lots of footage, if you want to look at, for example, Global News in Canada has this thing called Buy American, Buy Canadian, but Buy for American is spelled BYE as in goodbye, and BUY is used for Canadian as in go buy Canadian stuff. If you watch those segments, it becomes pretty clear they have a very low opinion of the average American's intelligence, and their kindness. And for the record, again, my experience with Americans is that they are far kinder than Canadians are. And so you have to be very careful on how you characterize this and make sure that you can back it up with some kind of statement. And again, even as I say that, I'm not saying every single Canadian out there is unkind unkinder than every single American. But that's where we have to be careful in how we speak about these things, because if we're not careful, we're going to, kind of group a bunch of people into a bucket that don't deserve it. First of all, and secondly, people may not actually fully believe, because what I'm finding is that, and what I want to hope, at least if it's true or not, is that where this is starting is people are upset with very specific individuals who happen to have some kind of Jewish connection, something like an Epstein, right? But if we're not careful on how we speak about this, and this becomes common parlance, suddenly we're going to find ourselves in the boat where, um, it's not going to refer just to specific individuals anymore. Maybe it goes to, the government of Israel, and then it goes on to, and again, that's not to say the government of Israel is beyond any kind of criticism. There's been a lot that they've done recently that I think deserves criticism. But if we're not careful, it will extend even from there and go on to an ethnic criticism, right? And that's where we're crossing, I think, a line at that point. So, again, who are we referring to? Are we referring, when we say this statement, to ethnic Israel, the government of Israel, or specific people? George Soros, the Rothschilds, which is a group, a well-known Jewish banking family that traces its roots back to, I think, the 18th century, and has gotten a lot of attention for the manipulation that they've done, the manipulation that they've brought on to different countries, particularly in the West. And so we have to be careful with this here. As far as making sure that we're not allowing one definition of Jews to slide into another definition instead. So, and one other thing too is, I'll just close it out with this here, is that when people make a statement like this, it's likely that the Jews are behind all the problems in the world today. I will argue that we're being very selective when we make that statement, because you can blame George Soros, the man who broke the Bank of England. Look that up if you're not familiar with that phrase. Or you can look to the Rothschilds and say they've caused a lot of great evil in society. They've caused wars, right? I don't think that's an unfair statement to make. These men who are behind a lot of these things they are genocidal, frankly. But that's the fact that they're Jewish is just coincidental, because you also have Bill Gates, the guy that's behind all of the cookie shots, right? And you have Charles III, who kind of sits behind the scenes, and I think some people know he's a bad guy, but they're not really familiar with just how bad Charles gets, and not just Charles, but his whole family. And this goes back. I mean, this probably extends to Elizabeth II, who I know was very beloved. During her, I think what's a 60-plus year reign. The entire royal family in the UK has a very dark history, and to give you a sense of where that goes, if you go back before Elizabeth to her father and her uncle, who were both kings on the throne beforehand, the British government was actually not completely convinced of which side Britain was going to be taking in World War II prior to September of 1939, when they entered the war. That's how twisted the royal family in the UK was back then, almost 100 years ago. It extends beyond that as well to earlier members of the royal family in the UK as well. But I just point that out to say that, if we're going to say that Group X is behind all the problems in the world, if you're going to say that, I think that you have to actually encompass everybody who's involved, right? The World Economic Forum, for example, that's a pretty broad group. They were the who's who of the elites. You had people from business, you had people from governments, you had people from these secretive, NGOs that were going to this village, Davos, in the Alps, right? I mean, that sounds very Bondish, right? I think that's why it was hard to believe for a lot of people when this news started to get out there. But at least that's broad, right? You can see how there's a vast conspiracy that could come out of that. If you're going to just kind of, you know, um, shrink it down to a specific ethnicity or a specific group of people, you really want to make sure that you're kind of encapsulating everyone who is involved in all the problems that we're going through here this decade. And just to be fair, I don't think that you can do that with even George Soros and Harvey Weinstein and Jeffrey Epstein and the Rothschilds, right? They are a part of the problems for sure. They're part of the group that is trying to cause all these issues and basically remake society in their image, but they couldn't do it alone, right? There isn't a whole lot of political power with those people. And believe it or not, as much as money does have a very large influence in a lot of our policies and the directions of our nations, it's not the whole thing. To be the big man, right, and provide the cash is only one element of what you need for a successful coup, right? Without that military power, you really are just a very rich person, sitting there as a sitting duck, ready to be poached, right? I think again, as we start this conversation, that's where I'll leave things off here today is to say, we want to apply just weights and measures. We want to make sure that we are speaking of, say, the Jewish people the same way that we would speak about any other group of people, right? Americans, Europeans, Japanese, whatever, right? You also want to make sure that you're you're making your terms clear, right? And I know that's hard again with a term like the Jews because, as we've discussed here today, that can mean one of many different things. But let's do ourselves a favor just to make sure that we're being clear about that because it is still a sensitive issue. But with the Overton window changing and shifting away from favoring the Jews, as we've seen, culturally in the last century since World War II, we want to make sure again that we are treating others as we would want to be treated. So I'll stop there for today. Again, feel free to leave comments in the chat. Any questions you have, anything you want to challenge on this, we will cover this again in future episodes here in the near future. I appreciate everyone who came and joined here today. I see that there was also some comments here that came out as well, and just appreciate your time here. Hope that you have a wonderful start to your week, and we will see you on a future episode.